When I first met Katie, she was already on horseback, thundering around the track with a look of steely focus I had never seen before. Her drive was part of what pulled me in. She was ambitious, disciplined, and passionate about her sport in a way that felt like she could never be truly tethered to the ground. Katie had grown up around horses, and when she told me her dream of one day being the best jockey in the state, it sounded bold. The kind of dream you'd expect from someone who couldn't stand to be ordinary. Our life together was never conventional, but that's what I loved. Katie's horse, a strong, chestnut stallion named Apollo, was almost like a third member of our relationship. I remember joking that if it came down to me or Apollo, she'd probably pick the horse. She laughed but never denied it. I chalked it up to her dedication. As the years rolled on, Katie got more competitive and driven, and I supported it. Hell, I was proud. But then things started changing, subtly at first, until one day, it was like I didn't know who I was living with anymore. It all started with her training schedule. Katie had always trained hard, spending hours at the stables with Apollo or running through forests to keep her stamina up, but recently, she began staying out longer. Her sessions became twice as frequent, and I rarely saw her before 10 p.m. anymore. She claimed her coach was pushing her harder because she was in line for a big competition, and she just had to be prepared. But her tone was different, like she was barely holding herself together when she talked to me about it. For a while, I believed her. She'd been working hard for this dream her entire life, and a big event was coming up that could make or break her career. Who was I to complain? But then one night, she came home around midnight, reeking of cologne that wasn't mine. I tried to brush it off. Maybe she'd brushed past someone at the stables, maybe she'd hugged a friend. But she seemed startled when I pointed it out, muttering something about one of the other jockeys helping her with Apollo, then quickly changing the subject. A few days later, Katie started dropping a name, Colin. She'd casually mention him, a fellow jockey who'd been around the stables lately. "Oh, Colin suggested this." Or, "Colin told me to work on Apollo's posture this way." Nothing too unusual, but she brought him up enough times that it caught my attention. I brushed it off, thinking she'd found a new training buddy or coach. But over the next few weeks, her late returns became more frequent. On a few occasions I'd text her around 9 p.m., asking if she was coming home soon, and she'd give vague responses, like, "Still training, don't wait up." The thought crossed my mind, but I tried not to jump to conclusions. I told myself it was just paranoia. Then one night I stayed up. Midnight came and went, then 1 a.m., then 2. She finally stumbled through the door just past 3 a.m., wearing that same cologne I'd smelled before. I didn't even ask this time. Instead, I watched her from across the room, barely able to hold my tongue as she headed straight to the shower without a word. It was almost like she was intentionally avoiding me. The next morning, she acted like nothing was wrong. She kissed me on the cheek, told me she'd see me later, and rode off with Apollo, heading for another long day at the stables. I decided I couldn't ignore it anymore. Something was definitely up, and I wasn't about to just sit back and play the fool. So, I took a few personal days from work, told her I'd been feeling burnt out, and spent that week keeping tabs on her schedule. Sure enough, she left every morning, training, until late, sometimes until the middle of the night. My suspicions grew darker by the day, and then I noticed a pattern. The nights when she came home smelling like that cologne were the same nights she had extra sessions with Colin. At first, I tried to brush it off, but the pieces were coming together in a way I couldn't ignore. After that night, I was no longer just suspicious. I was almost certain something was going on. The smell of another man's cologne lingering on her after hours away, the mysterious training partner she mentioned constantly, and her near-complete absence from home were more than enough to raise every red flag. But the real confirmation? That would come soon enough. It was around mid-October when Katie came home one evening, visibly flushed. She barely looked at me before slipping into the shower, her routine by now whenever she returned late. But tonight there was something different. She seemed nervous. The kind of nervous I hadn't seen since her first big race years back. After she finished in the shower, she came out and gave me a quick, tight-lipped smile. "Big week coming up," she muttered, almost like she was talking to herself. I was done tiptoeing around it. "Another week of late training sessions, I take it?" I asked casually, my eyes not leaving hers. She hesitated, just for a second, before nodding. "Yeah. Colin's been helping me with some new techniques," she said, her eyes darting down. "He thinks I'm really close to nailing it. If I can just get a bit more practice." It was almost impressive, the way she lied so easily. But there was something else, too, an unease in her voice I hadn't noticed before. Maybe she knew I was starting to see through her stories. Or maybe she just felt guilty, although she'd never admit it. Either way, that night solidified my decision. I was going to find out the truth, no matter what. The next morning, she left early, just as I'd expected. I waited half an hour, then grabbed my car keys and quietly followed her to the stables. Parking a good distance away, I watched as she saddled Apollo and trotted out of the stable yard, heading towards the woods behind the property. I didn't even know there were trails out there. She never mentioned them to me. It felt like a carefully guarded secret. I followed her at a distance, tracking her, as she led Apollo off the main path and deeper into the forest. After a few minutes, I lost sight of her. I parked my car, climbed out, and crept through the trees, keeping to the shadows as best as I could. About 15 minutes later, I finally spotted her again. But she wasn't alone. There, in a small clearing hidden by dense trees, she had met up with another rider, Colin. A tall, rugged-looking guy who seemed to have stepped out of a Western movie. He dismounted his horse and greeted her with an embrace that was far too intimate for just friends, or even training partners. They stood there, arms around each other, like two lovers reunited after a long separation. I watched, my fists clenched, as they led their horses off to the side and sat down on the grass together. They were talking in low voices, laughing, and then, right in front of me, they kissed. She didn't hesitate, didn't pull back. She kissed him like he was the only man in the world. The sight was like a punch to the gut. I felt a sick, hollow sensation in my stomach as I watched them. But I didn't leave. I forced myself to stay, to see everything, because I needed to know exactly how far this went. Within minutes, things escalated. Katie and Colin started undressing each other, their movements frantic, like they couldn't wait another second. I couldn't watch anymore, but I also couldn't look away. There they were, right in front of me, tangled up in each other, entirely oblivious to my presence just a few yards away. After what felt like an eternity, I turned and made my way back to my car, my mind reeling. The image of them together was seared into my memory, and no matter how hard I tried to shake it, I couldn't. But instead of despair, a different emotion took root: anger. White-hot, consuming anger. They thought they could do this right under my nose and get away with it. They thought I wouldn't find out. They thought I'd just be another clueless husband. I drove home, my hands shaking on the wheel. By the time I walked through the door, I'd made up my mind. I was going to get revenge, but not by blowing up or screaming. I was going to do it in a way they'd never see coming. The next day, I waited for Katie to leave the house and head to the stables. As soon as she was gone, I took my chance. I drove to the stable myself, parked, and walked quietly over to Apollo's stall. Apollo was there, calm and unassuming as ever, munching on some hay. I'd been around the horse enough times that he didn't shy away from me, but today I wasn't here to pet him. I reached into my pocket, pulling out a syringe filled with a powerful sedative, a pill that would take a little while to kick in but would last a good hour once it did. I carefully injected it into Apollo's neck, then gave the stallion a reassuring pat. He looked back at me with his gentle brown eyes, clueless about what was coming. I almost felt bad for the horse. It wasn't his fault his owner was a cheating liar. But this was the only way to get what I wanted. That evening, I waited, just as I had the night before. Katie came home, smelling like fresh hay and horses, her face a little too flushed, her eyes distant as she muttered a quick hello. It didn't take a detective to figure out what had just gone down in the woods. But if all went according to plan, her next meeting wouldn't be so flawless. Sure enough, the next morning, she was out the door early, off to her training session with Colin. I waited a few minutes, grabbed my car keys, and followed her once again. This time, I brought a small camera, determined to capture whatever unfolded. When I reached the clearing, I hid behind the trees again and started recording. There she was, with Colin, same routine as before: kisses, whispered words, hands exploring each other. But just as things started heating up, I heard a strange sound, a low, distressed whinny coming from Apollo. Katie and Colin stopped, looking over at her horse, who had started stumbling. His legs wobbled, and his eyes looked glassy as he took a few uneasy steps. Katie jumped up, half-dressed, and ran over to him, her face pale with worry. "Apollo! What's wrong, boy?" she cried, petting his neck, trying to calm him. But it was no use. The sedative had kicked in fully now, and Apollo collapsed, his legs giving way as he slumped to the ground with a heavy thud. Katie was frantic, shouting for help, looking around, but there was no one there to answer. Colin stood by awkwardly, unsure of what to do, while Katie kneeled beside her fallen horse, her hands shaking as she tried to keep him still. Meanwhile, I recorded everything from my hidden spot. The look of panic on her face was priceless, the worry for her horse, maybe even mixed with a bit of guilt for what she'd just done. I'd hit her where it hurt. Katie was in full panic mode. She knelt beside Apollo, her hands moving frantically over his neck and face, whispering things like, it's okay, please wake up." She had no idea what was wrong, and it showed. Meanwhile, Colin just stood there, looking useless and embarrassed, as if he knew he was part of a scene he shouldn't be caught in. "Help me!" Katie snapped at him. "Why are you just standing there?" I don't know what to do," he stammered, scratching the back of his neck. "I mean, he just fell over. Maybe we should get the vet?" But that wasn't an option, and they both knew it. Calling a vet would mean having to explain why they were alone together in the middle of the woods with a half-dressed jockey and a fallen horse. They were trapped, and it was all going down exactly as I'd planned. Katie looked around, desperate for some solution. Eventually, she pulled out her phone, still stroking Apollo's mane with her free hand. I watched from my hiding spot, still recording, as she frantically dialed her trainer's number. Pick up, she muttered, tapping her foot as the call rang out. Finally, she gave up and threw her phone onto the ground in frustration, burying her face in her hands. She looked lost and helpless, and for a second, I almost felt a flicker of pity. Almost. Colin took a few steps toward her, awkwardly patting her shoulder. "Katie, we need to go," he whispered, glancing around as if expecting someone to jump out of the bushes and catch them in the act. "I can't just leave him here," she shot back, her voice breaking. He's my boy. I don't know what's wrong, but I can't leave him alone like this." She sat there beside her horse for what felt like forever, stroking his neck, whispering things to him as if her words would be enough to rouse him. But the sedative was still at full effect, and Apollo didn't so much as twitch. Eventually, Colin convinced her to leave, promising they'd figure something out. She looked back at her horse one last time before following Colin out of the clearing, still visibly shaken. I stayed put, making sure they were gone, then slipped back to my car and drove home. I was still buzzing with adrenaline, half smiling to myself as I replayed the scene in my mind. The look on her face when Apollo went down, pure, unfiltered shock. If she thought she could betray me and walk away without consequences, she was dead wrong. When Katie finally got home that evening, she was a mess. Her clothes were stained from the forest floor, and her hands were shaking. She didn't even look at me as she walked through the door, heading straight to the kitchen. I followed her, watching as she poured herself a glass of water, her fingers trembling as she took a sip. "You okay?" I asked, keeping my tone casual. She nearly jumped, as if she'd forgotten I was even there. Yeah? Just rough day with Apollo." "Oh?" I raised an eyebrow. "Something happened at training?" Katie hesitated, her eyes darting to the side as she tried to come up with a story. "Yeah, he just collapsed. I think he might be sick or something. She paused, biting her lip, and for a split second, I thought she might actually tell me the truth. But then she shook her head, letting out a shaky laugh. Anyway, nothing to worry about. She tried to brush past me, but I wasn't done yet. I leaned against the counter, blocking her path. You sure? You look shaken. She forced a smile, but her face was pale, her eyes distant. I'll be fine. I just need some rest. Watching her like this, visibly unraveling, I felt a grim satisfaction. This was only the beginning, and she had no idea how much more I had planned. The next day, I packed a small bag with some essentials and left a note on the counter, telling Katie I'd be staying with my brother, Nick, for a few days. I didn't give her any details, just a vague explanation that I needed some space. When I got to Nick's place, he greeted me with a raised eyebrow and a concerned look. Everything okay, man? I hesitated for a second, then shook my head. Not really. I didn't get into specifics, but I told him enough for him to understand that something was going on with Katie. He offered me a beer and a place to crash, and I gratefully accepted. I needed time to plan my next move. The following day, I sent Katie a text, telling her to come home that evening. I didn't say why, didn't give her any details, just told her that I'd be waiting. I wanted her on edge, wanted her to feel the anticipation, to know something was coming but not know what. When she got home, she looked exhausted. She hadn't seen Apollo since their little rendezvous, and I could tell it was tearing her apart. I greeted her with a cold, almost polite smile, watching as she looked around the house, probably searching for some clue about what I was planning. What's going on? She finally asked, her voice hesitant. Oh, nothing much. I leaned back against the couch, crossing my arms. Just thought we should have a little talk. Clear the air. She swallowed, her eyes flickering with something between fear and confusion. About what? I pulled out my phone, opened the video, and hit play. I didn't say anything, just let her watch. Her face went pale as she saw herself in the woods with Colin, her arms wrapped around him, her voice low as she whispered things I couldn't make out. And then, the moment Apollo collapsed, the look of sheer panic on her face as she tried to figure out what had happened. Katie's hand flew to her mouth, her eyes wide with horror. How did you? Surprised? I said, my voice icy. You didn't think I knew, did you? You didn't think I'd find out what you were doing with Colin? She shook her head, her voice barely a whisper. I don't. I can explain. I held up a hand, cutting her off. Don't bother. I don't want to hear it. I already know everything I need to know. I stood up, grabbing my bag, my keys, and heading for the door. You chose him, Katie. Hope he was worth it. Before she could say anything else, I walked out, leaving her standing there, still staring at the screen. I didn't look back, didn't stop to see her reaction, just kept walking, my mind made up. Back at Nick's, I barely slept that night, running through every detail of what had happened, feeling a strange sense of closure. But I wasn't done. I knew Katie would try to cover things up, try to pretend nothing had happened. That was who she was, always hiding, always lying. But this time, I wouldn't let her. The next day, I sent her one last message, a video of her and Colin in the woods, clear as day. The video I sent Katie was short, just a minute or so, enough to make it clear what had happened, enough to shatter any hope she had of explaining her way out of this. I didn't say anything in the message. I didn't need to. The video said it all. She'd know exactly what it meant, and she'd understand that I wasn't coming back. The response was almost immediate. My phone buzzed, message after message flooding in from her. First, the messages were filled with desperate explanations. Please let me explain. It's not what it looks like. I can explain everything. You have to believe me. I never wanted this to happen. I didn't respond. I let her messages sit unread, my phone buzzing as she tried to call me, over and over. Her voicemails started piling up, each one more frantic than the last. In one, her voice was barely recognizable, cracking as she pleaded with me to talk to her, to give her a chance. I played it once, then deleted it, the sound of her voice hollow to me now. Whatever she was feeling, fear, guilt, shame, it was too little, too late. Days passed, and I continued ignoring her, letting her desperation build. I heard from mutual friends that she was barely leaving the house, that she'd been avoiding work and her usual routines. The whispers started circulating about why I wasn't around, about why she seemed so out of sorts, but neither of us offered any explanations. I wasn't interested in the gossip. I only cared about seeing how far she'd fall. Then came the twist I hadn't anticipated. One afternoon, I received a call from a friend of ours, Matt. He was one of those guys who was plugged into everyone's business, always the first to know who was doing what, and he sounded eager, like he'd been waiting to tell me something. "Hey man," he said, his voice laced with concern. "You haven't been around much lately." "Nope," I replied shortly, not giving him anything. I could tell he had something he wanted to say, so I waited. After a beat, he cleared his throat. "Look, I don't want to stir things up, but I thought you should know. People are talking about Katie. There's something you might not know." I clenched my jaw, bracing myself. "What is it?" Matt hesitated. "She's been spending all her time at the stables. Like, all day and most of the night. I even heard she's sleeping there sometimes, in one of the empty stalls. She's been staying with Apollo." I froze, not sure I'd heard him right. "Wait, what?" "Yeah," Matt continued, lowering his voice as if he were sharing a scandalous secret. "She's practically moved into the stable. People think she's lost it. She barely talks to anyone, and she's obsessed with Apollo, like she won't leave his side for a minute. Honestly, it's weird, man. She's gone off the deep end." I hung up, unable to process what I'd just heard. Katie, living in the stables, spending all her time with Apollo? She was a proud, driven woman who'd always cared about appearances, about winning, about being the best. The idea that she'd abandoned everything just to stay with her horse was surreal, like something out of a fever dream. My curiosity got the better of me, and that evening, I drove out to the stables. As I approached, I noticed the place was mostly deserted, just a couple of stable hands finishing up their duties. I parked my car, quietly slipped out, and made my way to the stables, sticking to the shadows. And there she was. Katie was sitting on a bale of hay beside Apollo's stall, her arms wrapped around her knees, her face buried against them. She looked completely defeated, her hair a tangled mess, her clothes rumpled and dirty. She was holding onto Apollo's halter like it was the only thing keeping her grounded. The sight of her, so broken and vulnerable, was jarring. This wasn't the Katie I knew. She was a shadow of herself, clinging to the one thing left in her life that she hadn't destroyed. I felt a pang of something, regret maybe? But it was fleeting. She'd chosen this path, chosen to betray me, and now she was dealing with the fallout. Part of me wanted to turn around and leave, but I stayed hidden, watching her for a few minutes, wondering what was going through her mind. Eventually she lifted her head, staring blankly at the ground. She looked like she hadn't slept in days, and her eyes were red and swollen. She muttered something under her breath, something I couldn't quite make out, and reached into her pocket, pulling out her phone. Her hands were trembling as she dialed a number, holding the phone to her ear. I could only hear snippets of her side of the conversation, but it was enough to understand what was going on. "Please, just pick up," she whispered, her voice cracking. "I'm so sorry, please, I don't know what to do, please." She was calling him. Colin. She called him several times, but each call went straight to voicemail. After the fourth attempt, she threw her phone down, her shoulders shaking as she fought back sobs. She was alone, truly and utterly alone, abandoned by the man she'd thrown everything away for, the man who'd been more than happy to indulge in a forbidden affair until things got messy. And now, with nothing left, she was clinging to Apollo, the only constant in her life. A strange mix of satisfaction and sadness washed over me as I watched her. This was the culmination of everything. She had destroyed our marriage, her career, her relationships, all for something as fleeting as a thrill, a moment of excitement with a man who'd clearly never intended to stick around. And now, she was paying the price. I slipped back to my car and drove away, leaving her to her solitude. The next few days passed with an eerie quiet. Katie hadn't tried to call or text me, and for the first time since the whole mess started, I felt some semblance of peace. But there was something haunting about it, too, a strange emptiness that felt both like freedom and like something had died and left a hole behind. Then, late one night, my phone buzzed. I stared at it for a moment, almost reluctant to pick it up, but curiosity got the best of me. It was a text from Katie. She'd sent just one message. "Can we please talk?" No frantic explanations, no desperate attempts to justify what she'd done, just a quiet request. I thought about ignoring it, but something about her tone, stripped down and vulnerable, made me hesitate. Against my better judgment, I texted her back, agreeing to meet her at a cafe near the stables the next day. When I arrived, she was already there, sitting at a table near the window, staring out at nothing in particular. She looked like she'd aged 10 years in the last week. Her face was pale, her hair pulled back in a messy bun, and she had dark circles under her eyes. As I walked over, she looked up, her expression hollow. "Thanks for coming," she said softly, barely meeting my gaze. I sat down, keeping my expression neutral. "What do you want, Katie?" She swallowed, her eyes flickering down to her hands, which were nervously fiddling with the edge of her sleeve. I just wanted to apologize. I know there's nothing I can say that will make up for what I did, but I just needed you to know that I'm sorry. Truly." The words hung in the air, empty and heavy at the same time. I didn't respond, waiting for her to continue. Katie took a shaky breath. "After you left, and after I saw the video, I realized that I've destroyed everything. My marriage, my career, my relationships, it's all gone because of a stupid, selfish mistake." I clenched my jaw, forcing myself to stay calm. "A mistake? Katie, it wasn't just a mistake. It was a series of choices that you made, over and over again, knowing exactly what you were doing." She flinched, looking down again. I know, and I hate myself for it." Her voice was barely a whisper. "Colin, he's gone. He stopped answering my calls, and I haven't seen him at the stables since that day." "So what? You're upset because he's gone?" I couldn't keep the bitterness out of my voice. "Because he didn't stick around to deal with the mess he helped create?" She shook her head quickly. "No. That's not it. I don't care about him, not anymore. I just wanted you to know that I'm not proud of any of it. I know I don't deserve your forgiveness, but I needed to say it." I stared at her, feeling a surge of anger, then pity, then something like exhaustion. "Katie, you didn't just hurt me. You hurt yourself. You hurt your career, your reputation, everything. And for what? A fling with some guy who ditched you the second things got tough?" Her face crumpled, and for a moment I thought she might start crying. But instead she nodded, her voice barely a whisper. "I know. I don't have anything left, except Apollo." The mention of her horse caught me off guard. "Apollo? What about him?" She looked up, her eyes filled with a strange, desperate light. "I've been staying at the stables, spending all my time with him. He's all I have left now. My trainer is talking about selling him, saying I'm not in the right mindset to take care of him, but I can't let that happen. He's all I have." For the first time, I felt a twinge of sympathy. Apollo had always been more than just a horse to her. He was her partner, her constant, the one thing she'd poured herself into even before we met. And now, he was the only thing she had left, the one piece of her old life that hadn't been shattered. "What are you going to do?" I asked, my voice softer than I intended. She took a deep breath, looking down at her hands. "I'm trying to buy him back, but I don't have enough. Everything I've saved up, it's not enough, and the stable owners aren't giving me any more time. I don't know what I'll do if they sell him." I watched her for a moment, torn between anger and pity. Part of me wanted to tell her that she'd brought this on herself, that she didn't deserve to keep Apollo after everything she'd done. But another part of me remembered the woman I'd once loved, the woman who'd poured everything she had into becoming the best jockey she could be. In the end, I made a choice. I'll help you buy him back. Her head shot up, her eyes wide with shock. What? I said I'll help you buy him back. I repeated, my voice firm. But this is the last thing I'll ever do for you, Katie. After this, I'm done. She stared at me, her eyes filling with tears, and for a moment I thought she might protest, might try to say something to change my mind. But instead she nodded, wiping at her eyes. Thank you, she whispered, her voice trembling. I don't deserve this, but thank you. The next few days passed in a strange blur. I met with Katie and the stable owner, helping her finalize the paperwork to buy Apollo. I paid the difference, signing off on the check without a word. Katie barely looked at me, too overwhelmed to speak, and when it was done, she just stood there, clutching the paperwork like it was a lifeline. As I turned to leave, she reached out, her hand brushing against my arm. Thank you, she said again, her voice thick with emotion. I know it doesn't make up for anything, but thank you. I nodded, not trusting myself to speak. Then I turned and walked away, feeling a strange sense of finality settle over me. This was it. The last tie that bound us, severed at last. A few weeks passed, and life slowly returned to a new normal. I was still staying at Nick's place, getting my own life back on track, and Katie had finally stopped calling and texting. She had Apollo now, and as far as I knew, she was still spending most of her time at the stables, practically living there. Then, one day, I received an envelope in the mail. There was no return address, just my name scrawled across the front in Katie's handwriting. I opened it cautiously, half expecting some desperate letter begging for forgiveness. Inside was a single piece of paper. A photo, actually. It was a picture of Katie and Apollo, standing together in the stables. Katie looked exhausted, worn down, but she was smiling, a real, genuine smile, the kind I hadn't seen in years. She was holding Apollo's reins, her hand resting gently on his mane, and there was something peaceful about the way she looked at him. On the back of the photo, she'd written a short message. Thank you. I'll never forget this. There was no apology, no plea for forgiveness, just a simple message, a final goodbye. And somehow, that was enough. After I received that photo, I felt a strange sense of closure. The chapter of my life with Katie was over, locked away in a painful but finished past. I moved out of Nick's place and into a small apartment on the other side of town, putting as much distance as I could between myself and everything that reminded me of her. Life started to settle, slowly but surely. I was finally free of the chaos Katie had left in her wake. A few months passed, and Katie drifted further and further out of my mind. I'd almost forgotten about the entire ordeal when, out of nowhere, an old friend of ours, Sarah, reached out to me. She wanted to catch up, said she'd heard, through the grapevine, that things had changed a lot between Katie and me. I figured she just wanted the gossip, but I met up with her for coffee, curious to see what she had to say. Sarah was an old friend from high school, someone who'd known both Katie and me for years. She didn't waste time with small talk. So, she said, leaning forward with a mischievous glint in her eye, what really happened between you two? All I know is that you've been separated, but she won't tell me anything. I chuckled, shaking my head. It's complicated, Sarah. Let's just say she wasn't exactly loyal. Sarah's eyes widened, her face a mix of shock and excitement. Katie? I can't believe it. She was always so serious about you, and about everything. Well, that's what I thought too, I said, shrugging. Turns out I didn't know her as well as I thought. Sarah looked down, tapping her fingers on the table thoughtfully. So, she's been living at the stables lately. I saw her the other day, actually. She looked rough. Like she's barely holding it together. I nodded, unsurprised. Yeah, she's been staying with her horse. I think she feels like he's the only thing she has left. Sarah's face twisted into something that looked halfway between pity and skepticism. It's just weird, you know? I mean, she was always obsessed with Apollo, but now it's like she's clinging to him for dear life. It's honestly kind of sad. I feel bad for her. I didn't know what to say, so I just shrugged. There wasn't anything left to feel, no anger, no sadness. She'd made her choices, and she was living with them. After my coffee with Sarah, I didn't think much more about Katie, figuring she'd continue her strange, secluded life at the stables. I didn't care anymore. I was moving on, building my life back piece by piece. But then, something strange happened. About a month later, I was at home, flipping through some old boxes of things I hadn't unpacked since moving in. Among the clutter, I found an old scrapbook Katie had put together of our life together, race day photos, ticket stubs from our first vacation, even some dried flowers from an old anniversary bouquet. I stared at it for a long time, feeling a mix of nostalgia and pain. But I couldn't bring myself to throw it away, not yet. So I shoved it back into the box and went to bed, feeling an old sadness stir up inside me. That night, I had a nightmare. In it, I was back at the stables, the air thick with the scent of hay and horses. I was walking down the stalls, calling Katie's name, my voice echoing in the empty space. I felt a strange urgency, like I had to find her, like something terrible was happening. I finally found her at the end of the row, sitting in the corner of Apollo's stall, her face buried in her hands. She was whispering something under her breath, over and over, her voice trembling. "Katie?" I called out, stepping closer. She looked up at me, and I felt a chill run down my spine. Her eyes were hollow, empty, like she'd been drained of every last shred of life. She opened her mouth to speak, but no sound came out. Instead, she just stared at me, her lips moving silently, her gaze distant and cold. I woke up drenched in sweat, my heart pounding. I couldn't shake the image of her empty, lifeless eyes, and the strange feeling of dread that had settled over me. It was just a dream, I told myself, just my mind playing tricks on me. But the feeling lingered, creeping into my thoughts throughout the day. A few days later, I ran into Sarah again, and she mentioned that Katie hadn't been around the stables lately. "It's weird," she said, frowning. "No one's seen her. Her car is still parked out front, but it's like she just disappeared." I felt a strange, uneasy sensation in my chest. "Disappeared? What do you mean?" "I mean, she hasn't been home, and she hasn't shown up at the stables," Sarah said, her face a mask of worry. "People are starting to talk. Some of the stable hands say they haven't seen her in over a week." A week. That didn't sound like Katie. No matter what, she wouldn't just leave Apollo unattended. He was her everything now. "Maybe she just went somewhere to clear her head," I said, though even I didn't believe it. Sarah shook her head. "No, it's different. There's something off. People are worried. Even her trainer filed a missing person report." The uneasy feeling in my chest grew stronger. Something didn't sit right, and I couldn't shake the thought that something was terribly wrong. A few days passed, and I couldn't stop thinking about Katie. Every time I tried to push it out of my mind, the image of her haunted eyes from my nightmare would resurface, filling me with a cold, creeping dread. Finally, I couldn't take it anymore. I drove out to the stables, arriving just as the sun was beginning to set. The place was deserted, eerily silent, and Katie's car was still parked in the same spot, covered in a thin layer of dust. I made my way to the stalls, the familiar scent of hay and horses filling the air. My footsteps echoed in the empty space as I walked down the row, passing one stall after another, each one empty. As I approached Apollo's stall at the end of the row, my heart began to pound, an inexplicable sense of dread settling over me. I stopped in front of the stall, gripping the edge of the wooden door as I peered inside. And that's when I saw her. Katie was sitting in the corner of the stall, her back against the wall, her knees pulled up to her chest. She looked thin, frail, her hair hanging limp around her face. Her clothes were dirty and rumpled, as if she hadn't changed in days. "Katie?" I whispered, my voice barely audible. She didn't respond, didn't even look up. She was muttering something under her breath, a low, desperate chant that sent a chill down my spine. I stepped closer, trying to make out the words, but they were incomprehensible, a jumble of sounds that didn't make sense. Katie? I tried again, louder this time. She finally looked up, her eyes meeting mine, and I felt a surge of horror. Her eyes were empty, hollow, just like they had been in my nightmare. There was no recognition in her gaze, no sign that she even knew who I was. She reached out a trembling hand, her fingers brushing against Apollo's mane, her voice a faint, broken whisper. He's all I have left," she murmured, her voice cracking. "He's all I have." I backed away, feeling a sickening sense of dread settle over me. It was like she was trapped in some kind of nightmare, unable to escape, clinging to Apollo like he was her last link to reality. I stumbled out of the stall, my mind reeling. I didn't know what to do, didn't know how to help her, or if I even could. I backed out of the stall, my heart pounding as I left Katie crouched in that dark corner, clutching Apollo's mane like a lifeline. I could still hear her faint, murmuring voice as I walked away, her words chillingly incoherent, almost like a prayer. Outside the stable, the night air hit me like a shock, snapping me out of the daze. I leaned against my car, trying to process what I'd just seen. Katie wasn't just heartbroken, she was lost, fractured, and spiraling down into something I didn't recognize. The woman I'd loved was buried beneath layers of guilt, desperation, and something else, something darker that left me with a gnawing pit in my stomach. Over the next few days I tried to push the memory of that night out of my mind, but it clung to me, creeping in at the most unexpected moments. I couldn't shake the image of her haunted, empty eyes or the way she'd whispered to Apollo, as if he were the only thing tethering her to reality. It was unsettling, but part of me felt like she'd chosen this, like she'd created this world for herself. Another part of me, a part one didn't like admitting existed, felt pity. She was unraveling, and it was obvious to everyone. Then I got a call from Sarah. "She's still there," Sarah said, her voice heavy with concern. "She's not leaving the stables, and now people are starting to talk. The stable owners are getting fed up, saying she needs to go. They're even thinking of selling Apollo if she won't leave on her own." The news hit me harder than I expected. Selling Apollo? That horse was her last attachment to anything meaningful in her life. Without him, she'd have nothing. I sighed. "What do they want me to do about it? Look, I know this isn't your responsibility, but can you talk to her? Just try to get her to leave, for her own sake?" I knew Sarah was right. I didn't owe Katie anything, but I couldn't ignore the fact that this woman, broken as she was, had once been my whole world. So, once again, I drove back to the stables. When I arrived, the place was quiet. A few of the stable hands nodded at me, their faces somber, like they understood why I was there. I walked down the row of stalls and found Katie in the same spot, looking even more ragged than before. Her clothes were torn and dirty, and her hair hung in greasy strands around her face. She barely looked like herself. "Katie," I called softly, stepping into the stall. She glanced up, her eyes vacant, and for a second, I wasn't sure she recognized me. Then her face softened, a flicker of something familiar crossing her features. "Why are you here?" she whispered, her voice weak. "I'm here because you need to leave, Katie," I said gently, kneeling beside her. "You can't stay here. They're talking about selling Apollo. You're going to lose him if you don't leave." At that, her expression crumbled, and she clutched Apollo's reins tighter. "They can't take him," she murmured, a wild look flashing in her eyes. "He's all I have left. He's everything." "Katie, you're hurting yourself," I replied, my voice firmer now. "This isn't going to bring anything back. It's only going to make things worse." For a moment, she was silent, staring at the ground. Then she looked up at me, and there was a spark of anger in her eyes. "You don't understand," she said, her voice trembling. "Apollo is the only thing keeping me sane. He's all I've got." "Katie, I do understand," I said, the frustration clear in my tone. "But this isn't healthy. You need help, real help, and staying here isn't going to give you that." Her face softened, her anger fading as quickly as it had appeared. She slumped back against the wall, her shoulders sagging. "I don't know what to do," she whispered. "I have nowhere to go, no one." "You have people who care about you, Katie," I replied quietly. "Maybe not in the way you wanted, but you're not as alone as you think." She didn't respond, her gaze fixed on the floor, her fingers nervously brushing through Apollo's mane. After a long, heavy silence, she nodded, a tiny, almost imperceptible motion. "Okay," she murmured. "I'll go. Just give me a few minutes." I left her there, giving her the time she needed. The relief that washed over me was almost overwhelming. This chapter was finally, truly coming to a close, and I could finally move forward, free from the weight of her betrayal. As I walked back to my car, I felt the weight of the past lifting from my shoulders. I stayed near the stables, waiting in my car and watching the entrance, expecting Katie to emerge any minute. But as the minutes dragged on, that relief I'd felt slowly gave way to something else, an anxious, gnawing doubt. I'd given her some space, sure, but it had been nearly half an hour, and still, there was no sign of her. Frustrated, I got out and headed back to the stalls, retracing my steps down the rows, my footsteps echoing through the empty stable. I reached Apollo's stall, bracing myself for whatever condition I'd find her in. But when I looked inside, the stall was empty. Katie was gone. I frowned, glancing around, searching for any sign of her. Then I noticed something strange. Apollo was still in his stall, but his halter had been left hanging on the gate, and a pile of her belongings lay scattered on the floor. Her phone, her keys, even her jacket. It didn't make any sense. Why would she just walk away and leave everything behind? A cold prickle ran down my spine as I bent down, inspecting the items. Her phone screen was cracked, like it had been thrown or dropped, and her jacket was torn along the sleeve. Something about the scene felt off, almost staged, like she'd left in a hurry or had been interrupted. I looked around, calling her name, but the stable was silent, empty except for Apollo, who watched me with a curious, almost concerned gaze. I felt my stomach twist with unease. Katie wouldn't just disappear without a trace, not after clinging to this place so desperately. Trying to calm my nerves, I started searching the stable grounds. I checked each stall, the tack room, even the small office at the front. But there was no sign of her anywhere. It was like she'd vanished into thin air. I stepped outside, looking around the stable yard, hoping to catch a glimpse of her somewhere in the distance, but the place was deserted, eerily quiet under the darkening sky. I didn't want to jump to conclusions, but something wasn't right. The way she'd left her things, the torn jacket, the cracked phone, it all felt wrong, like the beginning of a bad mystery novel. Finally, I went to the stable manager's office, hoping he might know something. He looked surprised to see me, but he listened carefully as I explained the situation, his face darkening as I described the scene in the stall. "Are you saying she's missing?" he asked, his voice tight with concern. "I don't know," I replied, my voice barely steady. "But she's not here, and she left everything behind." He nodded slowly, a thoughtful frown on his face. "Katie's been, well, we all know she's been going through a rough time, but this doesn't sound like her." He rubbed his chin, glancing out the window toward the fields beyond the stable. "I think we should report it. Just to be safe." I nodded, feeling a sick weight settle in my stomach. It was like the ground had shifted beneath my feet, leaving me standing on unstable ground, unsure of what to think or feel. Katie had been struggling, yes, but she wouldn't just disappear like this, not without a word, not without Apollo. The stable manager called the authorities, and within an hour, the police had arrived, filling the quiet stable yard with their flashing lights and hushed voices. They took my statement, asking about her behavior and recent actions, and I told them everything I knew. I watched as they combed through the stable grounds, interviewing stable hands, and searching the surrounding area. As the night dragged on, the reality of it all began to sink in. Katie was gone, truly gone, and no one seemed to know where or why. The police searched the stables and surrounding woods until dawn, but by morning, there was still no sign of Katie. They questioned everyone at the stables, friends, anyone who might have known where she'd go, but it was like she'd vanished. Her disappearance was now officially marked as a missing person case, and the investigation was expanding. I found myself caught between a strange mix of disbelief and guilt. I'd been the last person to talk to her, to see her, and now she was gone. I couldn't shake the memory of her in Apollo's stall that last time, her haunted expression as she'd whispered to her horse, clinging to him as if he were the last piece of herself she could hold on to. Her words echoed in my mind. "He's all I have left." 2 days later, I got a call from Sarah. Her voice was shaky, and I could hear the tension behind every word. "You're not going to believe this," she said. "They found something strange." "What do you mean?" I asked, dread settling over me. She hesitated, and then, in a voice barely louder than a whisper, she said, "They found a trail, footprints leading into the woods from the back of the stables. But the weird part? They just stop. They don't lead anywhere. No sign of where she could have gone." A chill ran through me, and I struggled to make sense of it. "So she just walked into the woods and disappeared? That's what they're saying," she replied, her voice distant, as if she couldn't believe it either. "They searched everywhere around that spot, but there's nothing. No sign of her or where she went." The police continued their investigation, but no new clues surfaced. Days turned into weeks, and the case grew cold. People started talking about Katie in hushed tones, whispering theories that bordered on the supernatural. Some claimed she'd simply lost her mind, driven to vanish by the weight of her mistakes. Others suggested she'd found some way to escape, to start over somewhere far away from the life she'd destroyed. But as for me, I was haunted by the last memory of her, crouched in that dark stall, her empty eyes fixed on Apollo, her voice cracked as she whispered to him like he was all she had left. I couldn't shake the feeling that she hadn't just walked away from her life. It was like something deeper had taken hold of her, pulling her into a darkness she couldn't escape. In time, the police scaled back their efforts, and people around town stopped talking about her as often. Katie became a shadow, a ghost story of sorts, the woman who'd disappeared into thin air, leaving behind nothing but a broken phone, a cracked life, and a bewildered horse. Every now and then, I'd drive past the stables, glancing toward the fields and the dark line of trees that bordered them, half expecting to see her there, standing silently among the shadows, waiting. But each time, there was nothing, only the quiet, only the emptiness. And somehow, that silence was more haunting than any of the nightmares I'd ever had. Months passed, and Katie became a story people would bring up only occasionally, often with the same tone you'd use when recounting an old mystery. I tried to move on, to let her disappearance fade into the background of my life, but it clung to me, a lingering question I couldn't shake. One evening, just as I was starting to feel like life might return to normal, I received a letter in the mail. There was no return address, but my name was scrawled across the front in a handwriting I knew all too well. Katie's. My hands trembled as I opened it, dread and morbid curiosity knotting together inside me. Inside was a single sheet of paper, and in the center, a brief message. "I'm free now. You were right. I'm where I belong." No signature, no explanation, just those words in her unmistakable handwriting. A chill crept over me as I read and reread the message, trying to make sense of it. Was this some kind of sick joke? Had someone found her, or was this all part of some elaborate plan she'd orchestrated? My mind spun, and a strange realization hit me. It didn't matter if Katie had written it before she disappeared, or if she'd sent it from somewhere far away. The message was clear. She was gone, truly gone. I took the letter to the police, hoping they'd find something, fingerprints, a clue, anything. They examined it thoroughly but came up with nothing. No new leads, no trace of where she might have sent it from, nothing to suggest she was still out there or that she'd ever truly been anywhere else. After that, I stopped driving by the stables. I stopped waiting for answers, stopped looking for signs that she might return. In some strange, unsettling way, the letter was her goodbye, a final, cryptic farewell that left me with a sense of closure as cold and empty as the night she disappeared. Katie was gone, and maybe, just maybe, she'd found the peace she was looking for. Or maybe she just vanished into the silence, becoming another part of the mystery that was now all she had left behind. Thanks for watching. If you enjoyed it, hit like and leave a comment with your favorite part. We'd love to hear your perspective.